Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, they don't play football, but Louisiana's Steelers were complaining about a bad call this week after a job-heavy steel mill was suddenly shut down. Industry is always a sensitive issue at the time of an election. Tonight, we will look at the state's energy industry and at the governor's race. And we'll also hear about the U.S. Supreme Court considering a Louisiana abortion law and an investigation of a promised sports field where high hopes gave way to broken expectations. All of this, plus a look at Gail Benson at the controls, are in the lineup for tonight's Informed Sources. Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Stephanie Grace, columnist, the Times-Picayune New Orleans Advocate. Kathy Finn, freelance journalist and business columnist for New Orleans Magazine. And Jeff Duncan, reporter, theathletic.com, for theathletic.com. And we're going to go over to E first because I think all of y'all can see we have a lot more color around us.
Yeah. For those who are keeping track, this is an historic night in the world of Informed Sources. Over the last few months, we've been nomads, going from sets to sets and different records. It all has to do with our main set downstairs, which we used for years, is now being used for TV and movie productions, which is how public TV makes a profit, tries to make money. So we're in an upstairs studio, which is fine as far as is doing the show. But it's taken a while to get everything together. But tonight is the debut of our new set, and so it's a proud moment. And one thing we've liked with the whole transition is, of course, having a round table, which is better for conversation. So
that absolutely is. We can see everybody's faces and expression, and a lot of interchange. And the designs that are surrounding us right now were done by a former staffer here at WYES. He now has his own production company, Tego Productions. That's Tom Gregory. So thanks, Tom. It works great. It really looks wonderful. I always love working with Tom. He's just terrific. Okay, let's go on now. Talk about some real serious stuff. So the Supreme Court says they're going to hear, they're going to take a look at the Louisiana abortion law dating back from 2014, right?
It is. I mean, the first thing to know is this is not the abortion law we've all been talking about recently. That was passed this past year and Governor Edwards signed. It's not that. It's not the fetal heartbeat bill. It dates back to the Jindal administration. Of course, Governor Jindal, anti-abortion, supported it. And it's been kicking around the courts all this time. What it does is basically says that a doctor cannot perform an abortion unless they have admitting privileges at a nearby hospital. And it's actually very hard to get admitting privileges if you do abortions. A lot of hospitals don't want to be associated with that. And this is one of the strategies that anti-abortion forces have adopted. There are two different ways they're trying to limit or eliminate abortions. One is to get Roe v. Wade overturned. One is, the full, it's no longer a constitutional right. The other is to kind of chip away at access, to chip away at the availability of abortion. And this is one way that abortion rights advocates say they're trying to do it, is to kind of, it would really restrict the availability of abortion in Louisiana. There would be, I think, one doctor who could do abortions.
So one clinic really would be operating at that time in the whole state.
Correct.
If this law is upheld.
And the question before the court is, does that place an undue burden on people seeking to practice what is still a constitutional right? Whether it always will be is another question, but right now it is. And that's kind of the working standard. That's been the working standard for a while. One of the things that's interesting about this is Texas passed a very similar law, and it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that it did place an undue burden. But that was 2016. So since 2016, what's happened? We have a couple new justices appointed by Donald Trump, Neil Gorsuch and Justice Kavanaugh. The key vote in that 2016 decision was Anthony Kennedy, who of course is no longer on the Supreme Court. So even the fact that the court said on Friday that it would take this case is kind of a signal that it's really going to look seriously at changing the precedent that it set just a couple of years ago. So it's going to be a big deal. It's the first abortion case that will go before this new incarnation of the court. And Louisiana politicians are already weighing in on it. Jeff Landry, the Attorney General, who of course is very anti-abortion, is calling it a pro-women law. Of course, a lot of people would dispute that. They're saying that there are health reasons to do that. That is the story. It is very much in dispute whether there's any medical reason for requiring this, but that is the argument. Bill Cassidy also embraces that. He's a physician.
So was it earlier this year where the U.S. Supreme Court basically said, okay, this law can't go into effect, because it would have gone into effect maybe earlier this year? Was that right?
It's been a little confusing because the first challenge was successful. That was to a federal court, a judge in Baton Rouge, a Democratic elected judge in Baton Rouge. But then the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeal reversed that, and it's a little confusing, kind of, so there were like conflicting decisions out there. So then the question went to the Supreme Court, can it take effect because the appeals court did uphold it, and the Supreme Court said no. And that was interesting because apparently Justice Roberts was one of the people who said no. So people are now looking at him saying, wait, is he someone who could maybe vote the way we don't think? Or is that just a kind of a procedural decision on his part?
Do we know when they'll take it up?
We do not. We know they haven't scheduled a hearing on it. The expectation is that it's going to be one of those cases that will go to the very end. All the hot court cases are decided in June. So the expectation is a decision will come down in June, which will be really right in the middle of the presidential contest, and it will probably be very politically charged.
Because it really does have a national focus now.
It absolutely does.
All right, and so Supreme Court, this new term starts
First
Monday
Monday
of
in
October.
October,
That's
yes.
right. Okie doke. All right, thanks a lot, Steph. All right, Kathy, over to you. A really surprising announcement this week, and took a lot of people, by total shock and surprise, especially those people who work there. Bayou Steel shutting down and also declaring bankruptcy at Bayou Steel and Laplace.
Right, and interestingly, they did this all at once, all within a 24-hour period. Bayou Steel has been in operation for about 40 years now, and this is actually the second time that they've declared bankruptcy. I was talking about this earlier. In 2003, the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Interestingly, they were bailed out of that. Basically, the company that enabled them to emerge from bankruptcy is the very same company that now is going to close them down. So it's a private equity firm based in Connecticut. Private equity firms, some of them focus on distressed properties, distressed companies under pressure. They go in, put a certain amount of money in, and hoping to turn them around and sell them at a profit. They always go in with an exit strategy. They know that eventually they're coming out of there one way or another. But this one, the shock here is just how quickly this happened. They announced on Monday, I guess it was, that they were totally laying off 376 people who had no idea before that
Well,
that
the
it was
union had
happening.
just renegotiated a contract, right?
By some reports, the company continued to interview for hiring and was continuing to do new contracts, with vendors and things like that just a week before. So it's very possible that many of the employees, even in management, did not know this was coming. It's possible they were carrying out these things without knowing it. But the really striking thing is there's a federal law called the WARN Act, W-A-R-N, which requires companies of more than 50 employees to give 60 days notice of a plant closing and give the workers an opportunity, at least a 60-day cushion to say, hey, what am I going to do next? How this is going to affect me? They did not do that here. They did send out the WARN notice to the states. They have a smaller plant in Tennessee. It's much smaller than Bayou Steel is, but it's called the Bayou Steel Group. They sent out notice of closing both plants as of November 30th. But they laid off their workers on the first day that they made this announcement. So they gave them no cushion whatever. The bankruptcy filing was ready to go. So obviously this has been in the works for weeks. And so they filed with the court the following day, and they did put in a request with the bankruptcy court to be able to pay those laid off workers what they were owed at that point, because they need the permission of the court to do that, and to pay about 50 or 60 other workers they're keeping on to keep the plant open for another, until the end of November. And I'm not sure whether, possibly within the last 24 hours, the court has ruled on that. I'm not sure about that.
The creditors are going to want to be paid too.
Well,
but,
they
they're
already,
really in debt.
and speaking of the documents in this case, they had to list their 30 largest creditors. So they have they have this entire list of, was already made out, and the pleadings and the documents were already done. The 30 largest creditors, the largest ones are owed maybe $1 or $2 million. But there's a handful of Louisiana these are mostly out-of-state companies, but there's a handful of Louisiana companies who are vendors to Bayou Steel, and they are owed in hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's a lot for a small company, and they don't know. This could go on for a long time. Perhaps they'll be made whole, but very likely in circumstances like this, bankruptcies like this, they may get pennies on the dollar. It's just as possible that they'll get pennies on the dollar.
Parish officials didn't know this was coming down. Was the parish president got a fax about it or something? You know, had not been consulted. So this is going to have a real economic impact on the community
Oh,
as a
terrible
whole.
impact, because 400 people in a small community like Laplace and the surrounding area and St. John Parish, that's tough, and it's not a wealthy area in the first place. So it's really serious pressure on those people, and some of those people have worked at Bayou Steel for decades. That's been their life. And where are they going to go? It's not like there are a lot of jobs hanging around of that type. They have certain skills. This was a steel making plant. So the governor and others blame tariffs, that were put in place last year on imported products. And Bayou Steel is one of these. It's a different kind of steel mill. It's one that relies on imported scrap metal and then they melt it down and make products that they sell domestically and elsewhere. So they've always been subject and kind of vulnerable to these tariffs. In fact, their first bankruptcy came after a set of tariffs was put in to protect the domestic industry, and it was just too much for them then. They haven't said actually that tariffs are the problem here, but I'm sure that affected them. Steel prices themselves are also weak, and U.S. Steel recently laid off some workers. So the industry is not real robust right now.
So these laid off workers, is there any effort to try to help them find other employment?
They haven't been told anything. I mean, ordinarily in a situation like this, the worker would get a packet and say, in 60 days you're not going to have a job, this is what's going to happen to your benefits, They didn't get anything.
Oh, that's really unfortunate.
And many of them, if they weren't at work that Monday morning, they heard it secondhand.
Well, really sorry for that,
It's
for
terrible.
how it's impacting all those people. All right, Kathy, thanks so much. Jeff, over to you. We're going to talk about a story called that you, in conjunction with Fox 8 News, you and Lee Zurich have been covering regarding promises of an athletic field that have just become broken dreams.
Yeah, it's another sad story. We're kind of a downer episode here of Informed Sources, but kind of a heartbreaking story. It should have been a feel-good story about Brian Bordanic. A lot of viewers, a lot of people might remember him post-Katrina. He was this feel-good story, Teach for America teacher at Carver High School, got assigned right out of the University of Georgia. And Carver High School is one of the few schools in town, one of the few public schools that has a big campus, has plenty of room for a football stadium. When I moved to New Orleans in 1999, I was kind of shocked that every high school didn't have its own football field. Well, the other markets I've worked in, it's kind of common to have your own stadium at the high school. We don't have a big geographic footprint in New Orleans, so there's not a lot of room for football fields. Carver's one of the few ones that has the room. Of course, Carver got wiped out after Katrina. We all know that story, about 10 or 12 feet of water in the upper 9th Ward. Brian Bordanic saw a need for a football field and hatched this kind of audacious plan to raise money, and he raised over $1 million in a 2-year period. Sean Payton gave money, Drew Brees gave money, Nike, Alyssa Milano, James Carville, a lot of big name people caught on to this story because it, like I said, was very much a symbol of hope and recovery in post-Katrina New Orleans. Barack Obama actually mentioned this field in his 5-year Katrina anniversary speech. Anderson Cooper based his 5-year anniversary week-long coverage at the site of the field. So this was a big story, and I remember distinctly in 2013 they had a groundbreaking ceremony. Tom and Gail Benson went to the event. City Council was there, a lot of civic officials, and they had the groundbreaking ceremony. The plan was to open the stadium in 2014. It was going to be a very basic stadium. $1.2 million doesn't go a long way, unfortunately, in constructing a new stadium. But that was the plan. And then every year after that, the football season would start, and I'd think, I wonder what happened to that stadium. What happened to that Field of Dreams? It was a big story, and it never, unfortunately, got built. We got around to digging into this about 3 months ago, and it's a heartbreaking story. I think the money has basically been squandered or clearly misspent.
But not by Brian Bordanic.
But not by Brian Bordanic. So let me back up.
Yeah.
Brian Bordanic, the original founder, he actually had a lot of people helping him in the construction and architectural community. Mark Ripple, one of the partners at Eskew, Dumez and Ripple, the largest architectural firm in the state of Louisiana, was working pro bono for free, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of architectural work for free, construction work for free. They got kind of pushed aside, the original group, because of a difference in opinion on the vision of the project. The original group wanted to build kind of a basic stadium for $1.2 million and then try to keep raising more funds later for a second phase. The basic stadium would have just a turf field, lights, very meager stands for about 500 people, and kind of portable bathroom facilities and concession stands. They would add that in phase 2. The group that came in was a group of Carver alumni that was invited in to be part of the board. Back in then, if you all remember, there was a lot of fears in New Orleans that outsiders were going to determine the future of the city. A lot of concerns of the gentrification, and I think this project in Carver was really caught up in that, with the charter school system taking over, and this project kind of fell under that umbrella and fell into the middle of that conflict, and the alumni group wanted a bigger, grander project, didn't have the money, and unfortunately kind of lost its way and never got it done.
The contract was entered into for what, $2.5 million.
Yes.
There were invoices that were submitted of the that there's $914 left, if I remember the figure correctly, from that million or million plus that had been raised. What was done? Anything?
Well, there's invoices for $400,000 worth of construction work. I'm not a civil engineer. I'm not a construction expert. We had some experts look at these invoices, and they say that this is typical work that would have been done to build a stadium. Unfortunately, it doesn't look to me like anything's been done. I've been down to the site several times. I know we live in a tropical environment where things grow quickly, but it's all overgrown. It looks to me like nothing's been done, even though hundreds of thousands of dollars was
But
invoiced.
didn't they hire a paid executive director, whereas before that everybody was working for free? Or?
Well, yes, they paid, the executive director was taking $5,000 a month in salary. She ultimately got paid $200,000 in 3.5 years and only raised $20,000 in donations. And the other thing I think is important to note here, when Brian Bordanic and his group were running the project, they had oversight from the Greater New Orleans Foundation. They wanted transparency. The new group came in, moved all the money out to a private banking account, so it was a lot harder
Who was
to
the project
follow.
manager on this?
Well,
is there a single project manager?
That's the group, the alumni group
And
that took over as a board of directors.
I'm going to have to direct folks now to theathletic.com for Jeff's story, because that's where Jeff is right now. But he's also working with Lee Zurich on this story at Fox 8, so you can find it over at Fox 8 too on there to find out more about it, because we have to move on to the next story.
Yes.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. All right, governor's race, Stephanie. We are
Yes.
really in the throes of it now.
A week away. Saturday, October 12th is election day. A lot of people have voted early, but this is the home stretch. And the question is it the home stretch towards the end, or is it the home stretch towards the next phase? In other words, will Governor John Bel Edwards be reelected, get a majority, 50% plus 1 is the magic number, and avoid a runoff, or will he have a runoff versus one of the Republicans running against him? To that end, the Republicans are really nervous. They're looking at the polls and they're thinking this might not happen. So we're going to have a couple of big visitors coming up this weekend and next week. Vice President Mike Pence will be in Kenner at the Pontchartrain Center on Saturday. Donald Trump Jr. and his girlfriend, Kimberly Guilfoyle, who used to work at Fox, they're going to be in Lafayette on Monday. And so we don't get the president yet. We probably won't, given everything that's happening, but we're getting some surrogates. And the interesting thing is the rally on Saturday is being billed as a unity rally, a GOP unity rally. So it's basically vote for this guy or this guy, vote for Eddie Rispone or Ralph Abraham, one of them, because we need a Republican. We need to keep John Bell short of that 50%.
Yeah.
So the party doesn't really care which one. They care. They've been running a pretty heated campaign between the two of them. Eddie Rispone, the businessman, has spent over $11 million of his own money. And they've really been attacking each other. So it's, unity is kind of an interesting pitch. But it hasn't been very
But the
unified.
fact is, they need to attack each other
They
because
do.
one needs to push the other
Because
out
it's
the
life
way
or death
to
for
get into a
them.
runoff.
The Republicans just want a Republican. For Abraham Rispone, it's second or go home.
So is Rispone polling ahead of Abraham, or was that just one poll?
They've been pretty close. There have been polls back and forth. Rispone has spent more money, and he's been advertising, and he's the one who started the attacking. He ran an ad against Abraham that a lot of Republicans were very angry about. They thought it was really doing kind of the Democrats' bidding. And before we started taping, I saw that Ralph Abraham put out a plea to Eddie Rispone to stop it, to basically say, we shouldn't be attacking each other. We should be going, shared goal is to keep John Bell from being reelected. Now that obviously benefits Abraham more than Risponi because he's the recipient
Right.
and he doesn't have all the money.
So Edwards camp, how are they feeling about everything?
They're feeling pretty good, I have to say. I mean, a lot has gone right for John Bell Edwards in this race, from the fact that these two Republicans are squabbling to, the fact that they're not the A-team. The A-team didn't get into this race. And he's done well in the debates. He's very good at that. He's gotten some Republican endorsements. They're hitting him pretty hard right now on an issue where he does have maybe some vulnerability, and that is he had hired a deputy chief of staff who had previously, years earlier, been accused of sexual harassment. And he was accused again as a staffer for John Bell Edwards. John Bell Edwards very quickly dismissed him, but there is a feeling that he should have known better, and there are some attack ads against him for that right now.
Okey-doke.
That's kind of the closing argument, I think.
The early voting ends, I think this week?
Saturday, it's this, and election day, October 12th.
Okay, thanks a lot, Steph. Kathy, energy industry in the state of Louisiana, what's it looking like?
Well, that's interesting you asked because I decided to write a column about that.
Yes,
I thought,
I read it.
how about just updating on the status of the energy industry? And as I started to think about it, I covered the oil and gas business years ago when it was a different time. And I got to thinking, it used to be a lot easier to size up the energy industry than it is today in Louisiana and elsewhere. And it occurred to me because there's so many complicating factors now. It used to be a matter of, what is the current spot price of crude oil? And if it was high, your energy is doing well. If it was low, probably not. But the good thing about that was that the industry itself was used to that boom-bust cycle. They knew, it was volatile, it was difficult, but there was a certain comfort in the predictability of it. You knew if the price was down, it was eventually going to come up because everybody needed oil, right? Well, today you've got so many different factors going on besides just the spot price of crude oil. One thing that has happened is that the U.S. has become a net exporter of oil largely because of the shale plays that have been found all over the country, and including here in Louisiana. And it enabled them, drillers, to get a lot of oil more cheaply than drilling offshore in the very deep waters of the Gulf or in the North Sea or something like that. So that has really added to the reserves of the U.S. and on the upside, it has made the country less dependent on OPEC and foreign sources and less politically vulnerable in many ways. But at the same time, now there's a glut. Worldwide, they're more subject to the demands of countries worldwide, and China specifically. And the economies of those countries, have a lot to do with what's going on. At the same time, we've got ambiguity about the future of fossil fuels themselves, and a lot of emphasis on renewable sources now. And there's a lot of push to make us more dependent on those kinds of sources. So that's another thing that's going on. There are erratic price fluctuations all the time. It just is unending, and so. Drillers, if they're going offshore, for instance, they need stability in prices. They need to know that 7 years from now, approximately what our price is going to be. It's almost impossible to say that anymore, to even guess at it logically. So what we've seen, and at the same time as all of this is going on, natural gas, right, which is abundant in Louisiana, in part because we have the pipeline system that brings in so much natural gas from the rest of the country. And it's enabled it's actually prompted the construction of so much of the petrochemical plants up and down the river, which has been $billion-dollar industry now.
So basically, it's a lot
it's
at play
very
that
complex.
Hadn't necessarily been at play in years before for our state's energy industry. So, we just have to.
It's
hope
hard
for the
to
best.
assess.
It's hard to assess.
It's hard on
All
the
right,
service
Kathy,
companies.
thanks a lot. Jeff, over to you to wrap us up with something on a real positive note. Gail Benson, now at the helm of 2 professional sports teams, and you've written about before how she's such a personable woman. And everybody knows that.
She's one of the few female professional sports owners in the country, and she's one of the most influential because, of course, now she's overseeing 2 professional franchises. And I think the most refreshing thing about Gail Benson early on is she really, I think, understands. She takes a different view of her role as owner of these professional teams. She sees them as assets to the city that she is basically just guiding. She considers herself a steward for the city of New Orleans, for the state of Louisiana, these 2 professional teams. Now, that's a different viewpoint than I think her ex-husband or her late husband, I should say, Tom Benson viewed it. I mean, the pro franchises here in New Orleans, Kathy knows this very well, really rely on a lot of public funds. In my opinion, it's totally different than, say, a Jimmy John's franchise. When you own a pro team like the New Orleans Saints, it's really a community asset. And I think there's community involvement, almost ownership to some degree. She gets that. She understands it. And I think it's very refreshing. I think it's one of the reasons why she's become very popular in a very short period of time.
And so what's the attitude like when you go around the offices there, the Saints and the Pelicans?
Well,
you know,
I mean, there's a lot of excitement. I mean, the Pelicans, the whole dynamic has changed with the drafting of Zion Williamson and also the new general manager out there, David Griffin.
A couple of high-profile women on staff too. Which
Yes,
is interesting.
David Griffin has changed everything out there. The new general manager. A lot of them now are living in New Orleans. That didn't happen before. Really embracing the community, and that has changed almost overnight. And there's just a lot of enthusiasm.
And is Gail still continuing with her personal notes? She's
Yes.
such a busy lady now.
Yes, when I left the Times-Picayune, I got a personal
Did you
note,
really?
2 days later from Gail Benson wishing me luck. So yeah, it's very unique the way she's running these big, large, almost Fortune 500 companies. That it feels a lot like a mom and pop operation.
She's always had an innate sense of public relations and how to communicate with people and how to really put the best face on that organization. As you said, much better, I think, than Tom Benson himself had. He didn't really understand all of that very well. And she instinctively knows how to,
She does.
speak to people
in a very
and
strong
respond.
but genteel way. All right, guys, we have to
Interesting,
look ahead now. Go ahead, real quick.
A quick donation to John Bell Edwards in support of him.
Yes.
So,
All right,
politics too.
looking ahead. E.
The convention center has just completed a transportation center which combines the taxis and the Ubers and the buses all together in one spot, which they say is like the cutting edge for all the convention centers in the nation. Coming next is a project to convert Convention Center Boulevard into more of a pedestrian park.
All righty, Steph.
Supreme Court, as we said, opens Monday. On its first day, it's hearing another Louisiana case. Interesting, it's about unanimous juries, whether non-unanimous juries are constitutional. We thought we took care of that. That was for cases, the constitutional amendment in the state going forward. This is a case that's already been through trial where somebody was convicted 10-2. His argument is that's unconstitutional. The fact that the court took it is maybe a sign it's going to shift and go with it.
Okay,
So
we'll
keep
look
an
at that. Kathy?
Well, I'll pick up on what you mentioned, Stephanie. The Saints, it's another Saints weekend, of course, but the Superdome, Gail Benson is, of course, in negotiations and been talking closely with not only John Bell Edwards, but the legislature about another upgrade for the Superdome. $450 million, I think, was the figure that was put on it. And so, once again, we go around getting that public money for the dome.
Jeff?
Yeah, and look, speaking of the Pelicans, if you want to get a chance to see them for the first time Saturday night, they're having an open practice at 6 p.m. at Smoothie King Center. It's already sold out, so
tickets?
if you don't have a ticket, it's sold out, but you can find it online at pelicans.com. They're going to stream the whole practice.
Oh, cool.
Great. All right. Thanks, guys, for being here in our new set. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.